The condemned stood in silence, shackled and trembling, as a sea of faces gathered to watch. There would be no swift death here. Every scream, every gasp of agony was part of the spectacle, a grim reminder from the crown. This is the price of betrayal in the medieval world. Execution wasn't only about ending life. It was a stage, a warning, and a theater of fear. But among the gallows, the headsman's axe, and the flames, one method stood above all, whispered in dread for centuries. What was the most feared execution of the Middle Ages? From the 11th to the 16th century, across Europe's kingdoms and principalities, execution was not a hidden act behind prison walls. It unfolded in open squares, at crossroads, and beneath the shadow of city gates. Justice in the medieval world was not only about removing the guilty from society, it was a spectacle, a public event meant to be seen, remembered, and feared. For rulers, the act of taking a life was not simply the conclusion of a trial. It was a demonstration of power, a visible reminder of the state's ability to enforce its will. Monarchs, feudal lords, and city magistrates all understood the symbolic value of the scaffold. In times of political instability, executions could calm unrest by showing swift retribution against rebels or traitors. In moments of moral panic, during witch trials or heresy hunts, they served as visible proof that the authorities were defending the faith and the community's moral order. The chosen locations for executions reflected this purpose. Many took place in central marketplaces, where the largest crowds could gather. In London, the Tyburn gallows became infamous, with executions there attracting spectators from miles away. In Paris, the Place de Grève, now Place de l'Hôtel de Ville, served as the principal site for centuries. Other cities placed their gallows or execution grounds along major roads, ensuring that travelers and merchants would see the rotting remains of the condemned, a warning to anyone considering defiance. These events drew people from all walks of life. Merchants paused. Their trading, farmers traveled in from the countryside, and even children were brought along. In many places, schools closed on execution days. The act of watching someone die was not seen as inappropriate for the young. It was thought to be a moral lesson. A man dangling from the rope or burned at the stake was intended to instill obedience. Over time, this repeated exposure hardened the public, making violence part of the social landscape. Executions were carefully staged. A condemned person might be paraded through the streets before reaching the scaffold, their crime proclaimed by a town crier. This ritual humiliation turned the journey into part of the punishment, forcing the condemned to endure the taunts of the crowd. The method of execution was chosen not only for its effectiveness, but for the message it sent. Beheading was reserved for the nobility, signaling a death with some measure of dignity. Hanging, burning, or the breaking wheel were for those of lower status, or for crimes that the authorities wanted to mark with infamy. In kingdoms like England, treason was punished with particularly elaborate executions, ensuring maximum spectacle. In the Holy Roman Empire, the breaking wheel, which could take hours to kill, was intended to erase any sense of the condemned as a fellow human being. In the Papal States, public burning for heresy demonstrated both the Church's theological authority and its cooperation with secular rulers. The medieval audience did not view these scenes with modern sensibilities. Death was more familiar, life expectancy shorter, and violence more visible in daily life. Feuds, battlefield casualties, and plague outbreaks were common. In this context, public executions did not stand apart from ordinary experience. They were woven into it, Chroniclers and municipal records from the period describe executions in straightforward terms, without expressions of horror. This normalization was part of their power. The spectacle worked because it felt ordinary enough to be accepted, yet extreme enough to remain memorable. Still, the emotional impact was real. A public execution could be unsettling, even for those accustomed to hardship. Contemporary accounts note moments when the condemned spoke defiantly from the scaffold or publicly forgave their executioners, creating scenes that stayed in the public memory for years. The crowd might react with silence, prayers, or, in some cases, open hostility toward the condemned. Depending on the crime and the political climate, the spectacle also carried an unspoken warning for entire communities. When a rebel leader was executed, his supporters were meant to see not only his death, but the destruction of his body as a symbol of the movement's defeat. When a thief was hanged, the local poor were reminded that hunger or desperation would not excuse breaking the law. For rulers, this was a necessary balance. The justice system had to be visible enough to deter, yet controlled enough to avoid sparking sympathy for the condemned. There was also an economic dimension. Market stalls thrived on execution days, selling food and drink to those who came to watch. Inns filled with visitors. In some regions, executioners received a share of the profits from such days, turning the act into part of the urban economy. This blending of commerce with punishment further reinforced the execution as a communal event rather than a private sentence. But not all executions were equal. While hanging or beheading could be over in minutes, other punishments were deliberately designed to prolong suffering. Methods like boiling alive, impalement, or the full process of being hanged, drawn, and quartered were reserved for crimes considered beyond ordinary evil acts that threatened the stability of the realm or the sanctity of the faith. These punishments were rare, but when they occurred, they became the most discussed events in the region, retold for decades. In this era, public death was a cornerstone of legal authority. It communicated the reach of the ruler's hand, the unity of church and state, and the consequences of crossing them. To witness it was to participate in a shared cultural ritual, one that reinforced hierarchy and obedience. As the centuries progressed, the political uses of public executions grew more refined. During times of rebellion, rulers often staged multiple executions in a single day, turning the spectacle into an unmistakable declaration of control. The execution of William Wallace in London in 1305, the burning of Joan of Arc in Rouen in 1431, and the mass killings following failed uprisings all followed this principle. Make the punishment unforgettable so that the crime itself is never attempted. Again, this was the age of public death, an era when the state's most feared message was carved into the minds of its people not through laws on parchment, but through bodies on the scaffold. And while many met a swift end, others faced something worse. Punishments so prolonged and calculated that they became legends of fear. These were the executions that haunted the medieval imagination, and one of them would stand above all as the most dreaded of its time. By the late Middle Ages, execution had evolved beyond a legal sentence into a carefully managed performance. Every stage of the process, from the announcement of the crime to the final blow, was orchestrated to ensure maximum impact. These were not events meant to pass quietly. They were staged for the public, designed to be remembered, retold, and feared. The first act often began with the town crier. In the days before printed news sheets were common, his voice carried the details of the crime and the date of the punishment. Moving through the streets, sometimes accompanied by drummers or trumpeters. He declared the charges in the name of the ruler or the court. This announcement served two purposes: to spread word of the coming spectacle, and to fix the crime in the public mind. The condemned was often portrayed in the harshest terms, their guilt presented as indisputable, ensuring that when the day came, the crowd arrived ready to see justice done. On the appointed day, the marketplace, or central square, became the stage. Merchants set up stalls, anticipating larger crowds. Some towns treated executions as rare holidays, with taverns overflowing and temporary stands selling hot food and drink. The execution itself was the centerpiece, but the surrounding activity turned it into a festival-like gathering. In large cities like Paris, Hamburg, or London, thousands could gather, their sheer numbers magnifying the psychological weight of the occasion. The placement of the scaffold, or gallows, was deliberate. It was built high enough so that even those at the edge of the crowd could witness the moment of death. In many places, the execution site was permanent. The Tyburn gallows in England, for example, was a fixed location for centuries, its notoriety woven into London's identity. Other towns set up temporary structures in front of castles, on bridges, or beneath city gates. These locations carried symbolic meaning. A castle backdrop reminded spectators of the ruler's authority. A bridge execution forced merchants, travelers, and locals alike to pass the scene, unable to avoid its message. A city gate ensured that anyone entering or leaving was confronted by the state's power. The journey of the condemned to the execution site was part of the theatre. In England, those sentenced to die at Tyburn were taken in open carts from Newgate Prison, moving slowly through the streets, while crowds jeered or prayed aloud. In German principalities, prisoners might be forced to carry the instrument of their death, such as the sword for beheading or the rope for hanging. In France, the cart itself was often a symbol. The same vehicle used for transporting the dead to cemeteries now carried the living to their final punishment. Once on the scaffold, the performance continued. In Catholic regions, a priest or friar might address the crowd, urging the condemned to repent and the spectators to take warning. In Protestant cities, ministers gave sermons emphasizing obedience to earthly authority. Sometimes, the condemned were given the chance to speak, either confessing guilt or protesting innocence. These final words could sway public opinion, creating moments of unexpected tension. In rare cases, a defiant speech could turn a condemned traitor into a folk hero, something authorities worked hard to prevent by controlling access to the scaffold. The executioner was central to this display. Far from being a shadowy figure, he often stood in plain view, dressed in distinctive clothing, his role publicly acknowledged. In some cities, the executioner's name was well known, and his skill, or lack of it, discussed openly. A clean, swift stroke of the sword could be met with applause, while a clumsy, prolonged death could provoke anger or disgust. Even so, the executioner was an agent of the state, embodying its control over life and death. Underlying the spectacle was a calculated psychology. Public executions were meant to deter, but deterrence depended on memory, the drama of the occasion, the journey through the streets. The speech, the final moment, was designed to etch the image into the minds of all who watched. For the authorities, fear was most effective when paired with ritual, and ritual was most effective when witnessed in large numbers. Over time, the crowd's role shifted. Early in the medieval period, Public killings could provoke genuine shock, especially when punishments were exceptionally brutal. Chroniclers in the 12th and 13th centuries sometimes noted the horror of the onlookers, but by the 15th and 16th centuries, in many urban centers, executions had become so familiar that the crowd's reaction changed from solemn witness to active participant. Spectators shouted insults, sang songs, or threw objects at the condemned. In some cases, they competed for relics, scraps of clothing, a drop of blood, believing they carried magical or protective properties in places like the Low Countries, where executions sometimes followed elaborate trials for heresy. The crowd could also become a moral chorus, shouting out condemnations in unison. In England, ballads recounting the crimes and deaths of executed criminals were sold on execution days, allowing the story to be sung in taverns long after the event. This merging of punishment with entertainment deepened the cultural acceptance of the scaffold. Theatre also meant repetition. Those who lived in major cities might witness dozens of executions in their lifetimes, each reinforcing the same lessons. The law was absolute, the ruler's word final, and disobedience deadly. For children growing up in such environments, the sight of the gallows or the breaking wheel became part of the city's normal rhythms. This was the theatre of terror, a deliberate, ritualized system of public killing, designed as much for the living as for the dying. Every announcement, every procession, every carefully chosen location turned justice into a performance. The audience left not only having seen a sentence carried out, but having been reminded, in the clearest possible terms, of the consequences, of defying the powers that ruled their world. By the High and Late Middle Ages, the ways in which a person could be executed were as varied as the crimes they were accused of. Methods were not chosen at random. They reflected the values, fears, and political needs of the time, and they sent a carefully measured message to all who watched. Death was not simply an end, it was a statement. Hanging was the most common form of execution for commoners across much of Europe. It was inexpensive, straightforward, and public. The condemned would stand on a cart or scaffold, a noose placed around the neck, and the support removed. In earlier centuries, the drop was short, causing slow strangulation rather than an instant death by breaking the neck. This could take several minutes, with the prisoner often convulsing before falling still. Only in later periods, particularly by the 18th century, did the long drop become common. In the medieval context, hanging was both punishment and humiliation. The body left on the gallows as a visible warning to all. Beheading was considered a more honorable death, usually reserved for nobles, knights, and those of high social standing. It was a method that, in theory, allowed for a swift and clean execution. In practice, it depended entirely on the skill of the executioner. A single stroke of the sword or axe could end life in an instant, but a poorly aimed blow might require 2 or 3 attempts, prolonging the ordeal in front of the assembled crowd. In England, the axe was favored. In much of continental Europe, the sword was more common. Beheading signified that while the condemned had lost favor, their social status afforded them a dignified death. Burning at the stake carried powerful symbolism, especially in cases of heresy or witchcraft. The fire was both a physical punishment and a representation of spiritual damnation. The condemned was secured to a post, often with iron chains, and surrounded by wood or faggots. Death could come from smoke inhalation before the flames reached the body, but in other cases, it was the fire itself that ended life. The public nature of the execution was intended to demonstrate the absolute rejection of the condemned's beliefs and to purify, in the eyes of the authorities, the community from their influence. The burning of Joan of Arc in 1431 in Rouen is among the most famous examples, used by the English crown and its Burgundian allies to portray her as a heretic rather than a political martyr. Boiling alive was rare, but employed in certain regions for specific crimes. In England, a statute of 1531 under Henry VIII prescribed boiling for those convicted of poisoning, seen as an especially treacherous crime. The condemned was placed in a large cauldron or vat of water or oil, which was then heated. Contemporary accounts describe the screams and thrashing lasting for several minutes. Though uncommon, the sheer horror of boiling ensured it remained in public memory far longer than its limited use might suggest. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was among the most brutal methods, primarily used in the Holy Roman Empire and parts of France. The condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, and the executioner used an iron bar or hammer to methodically break the bones, often starting with the legs and working upward. Sometimes the blows were fatal quickly. In other cases, the victim was left alive for hours or even days, displayed in public as a warning. The wheel itself, raised on a pole, made the body visible from a distance, a grim landmark at the edge of towns. Flaying, the removal of skin, was a punishment so extreme that it was rarely used. But when it was, the act was intended to resonate for generations. Historical records show it being carried out in cases of treason or rebellion. In 14th century England, the Mayor of London, William Fitzosbert, accused of inciting revolt, was said to have been flayed before being executed. In the Persian tradition, and in some accounts from the Ottoman Empire, flayed skins were displayed on city walls or gates as a potent deterrent. The rarity of flaying made it a punishment for only the gravest crimes against the state or ruler. Drowning appeared in different forms depending on the region. In some German and Dutch towns, women convicted of infanticide or theft might be sewn into sacks, sometimes with animals, and thrown into rivers. In Scotland and England, drowning was occasionally used as an alternative to burning for women, seen as more modest since it avoided public exposure of the body to flame. In maritime law, mutineers could be executed by being dropped into the sea with weights attached. The choice of execution method was more than a practical decision. It carried layers of meaning tied to status, crime, and politics. Nobles might be spared the gallows but faced the axe. Commoners accused of heresy could face the stake, while high-born heretics might still be burned to make an example of them. Some crimes were seen as so corrupting to the social order that the manner of death had to be visibly worse than the crime itself. Treason, in particular, inspired the most elaborate punishments. These associations were reinforced through law and custom. In England, petty treason, the killing of a social superior, could mean burning for women or hanging for men. High treason often involved a sequence of punishments: hanging, drawing, and quartering for men, burning for women. In parts of continental Europe, counterfeiting currency, considered an attack on the ruler's authority, could result in boiling or burning. Religious crimes were handled with a special severity. The Church, though it often handed the condemned over to secular authorities for execution, maintained that heresy endangered not only the soul of the accused, but the spiritual health of the entire community. By making the punishment a public act, fire, especially, it sent a theological message that heresy was to be cleansed completely. The Inquisition's trials and the Order F ceremonies in Spain and Portugal were built around this public spectacle of purification. The severity of these punishments reflected the realities of medieval justice, a world without prisons for long-term incarceration, where deterrence relied on visible, memorable, and terrifying examples. Public executions were meant to live in the mind, reinforced by the brutality of the method chosen. Not all punishments ended with death itself. In many cases, the display of the body was an essential part of the sentence. Heads were placed on spikes atop city gates. Bodies broken on the wheel were left in place until they decayed. Gallows might hold multiple corpses at once, a constant visual reminder to anyone entering or leaving a town. In some traditions, execution sites became landmarks, known as gallows hills or traitors' gates, their names preserving the memory of past punishments. These methods formed a hierarchy of death, understood by all in the medieval world. The nature of a person's end said as much about their social standing and the perceived gravity of their crime as any words could. A quick, clean stroke of the sword was a mark of status. The slow agony of the wheel or the flames signaled a crime that had pit in the eyes of rulers, torn at the fabric of order itself. Within this grim spectrum, one method would stand apart. A punishment so feared, so elaborate, and so public that it became a byword for ultimate justice. Its name would be remembered long after the gallows and stakes had rotted away. The Middle Ages offered no shortage of grim punishments, each capable of instilling fear in those who saw or heard of them. Yet, among the gallows, the stake, and the breaking wheel, there were certain methods whose notoriety rose far above the rest. Chroniclers, jurists, and foreign observers wrote of them in language heavy with revulsion. Their rarity did not diminish their power, it amplified it. A death so drawn out, so layered with symbolic humiliation, would not fade from memory. For many regions, the breaking wheel was the pinnacle of public cruelty. In the German states of the Holy Roman Empire, its victims could be left to linger. For hours, their shattered limbs displayed on high. The wheel's visibility made it infamous, but it was not always the most feared. In France, burning at the stake carried the greatest weight of dread, especially when used for heresy. This was not simply an execution. It was a public declaration that the condemned soul was beyond saving, condemned to flames both temporal and eternal. The burning of the Knights Templar in 1314, including Grand Master Jacques de Maure, remained a cultural touchstone for centuries. But there was one method that in England eclipsed all others, a punishment reserved for the highest crime imaginable, high treason. It was not a single act, but a sequence of torments. To be sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered was to face a death meticulously staged for maximum horror. From its codification in the late 13th century until its final use in the early 19th, it was designed to obliterate not only the body of the traitor, but their honor, legacy, and memory. English chroniclers did not shy from describing it. The condemned would first be tied to a wooden hurdle or sledge and dragged through the streets from the prison to the place of execution. This slow public journey humiliated the prisoner and gave the crowds time to hurl insults, rotten food, or stones. Upon arrival, the victim was hanged, but not to the point of death. Instead, they were cut down while still conscious. What followed was mutilation, the removal of the genitals, the opening of the abdomen, and the removal of the intestines, often burned before the victim's eyes. Only then would the executioner behead the condemned, their body divided into 4 parts. These quarters were sent to various cities or displayed on gates and bridges, while the head was set on a spike, most often above London Bridge. Its origins can be traced to the reign of King Edward I, who sought a punishment that matched the gravity of betraying the crown. One of the earliest high-profile uses was in 1283, against Dafydd ap Gruffydd, Prince of Wales. After rebelling against English authority, Dafydd became the first recorded nobleman to suffer this fate. His execution set a precedent. High treason would not only be punished but annihilated in the public consciousness. Accounts from chroniclers make clear how deeply this sentence imprinted itself on the medieval imagination. The Westminster Chronicle describes the 1381 execution of Sir John Ball and other leaders of the peasants' revolt in deliberate detail, emphasizing the display of their body parts as a deterrent to further unrest. In 1606, the surviving conspirators of the Gunpowder Plot, including Guy Fawkes, were subjected to the same end. Contemporary observers wrote of the crowds swelling to witness the punishment, knowing they would see a form of death rarely carried out in full. Foreign visitors were often shocked by its severity. The French chronicler Jean Froissart remarked on the theatrical nature of English executions for treason, noting the precision with which each stage was carried out and the ceremonial placement of the remains. Even within England, it was recognized as exceptional. Ordinary crimes, no matter how violent, did not merit such treatment. Only betrayal of the sovereign or the realm justified it in the eyes of the law. What made this method stand apart was its combination of spectacle, mutilation, and message. Hanging alone might deter a thief, but the destruction of the body in multiple stages sent a different kind of warning. It told all who watched that treason struck at the heart of the kingdom and would be repaid not simply with death, but with erasure. In an age where reputation and lineage were paramount, the public scattering of one's remains was as devastating as the physical suffering itself. It was also a punishment with an afterlife. Long after the bodies were taken down and the sites cleaned, the memory of the execution lingered in political propaganda, plays, and ballads. Children would grow up hearing the names of traitors and the fate that befell them, reinforcing loyalty to the crown through shared stories of retribution. The heads of William Wallace in 1305, Thomas More in 1535, and countless lesser-known rebels became fixtures of the city's skyline for weeks or months. Travellers crossing London Bridge could not miss the line of decaying faces staring down from the Gâchis. There were, however, rare instances where elements of the punishment were omitted, often due to status, royal mercy, or political calculation. A condemned noble might be beheaded after the hanging rather than subjected to prolonged mutilation, or parts of the body might be returned to the family for burial. Yet even these mitigations were framed as acts of royal generosity, reminders that the crown controlled not only life and death, but the manner in which both were granted by the later Middle Ages. The fear of this punishment had grown to such a point that it was invoked even when not carried out. Threatening an accused traitor with being drawn and quartered could be as politically effective as the act itself. The phrase entered common speech as a synonym for absolute ruin. It is no coincidence that in many historical surveys of medieval punishment, this method stands as the most feared. It combined the key elements of medieval justice: public humiliation, physical agony, symbolic destruction, and political warning. Its victims were almost always figures of political importance, which meant the entire realm heard of their fate. And unlike the burning stake or the gallows, The punishment did not end at the moment of death. The display of the remains prolonged the execution's impact for weeks or months, ensuring that its lesson endured. When the scaffold was dismantled, when the last of the cheering or jeering crowd drifted away, the execution's true work began. Travelers and merchants carried the story to distant towns. Chroniclers set it down in manuscripts. Children asked their elders about the grisly trophies above the gates. And so the punishment lived on, its horror magnified with each retelling. In a medieval world where the law relied on memory as much as force, no other execution method combined spectacle, duration, and symbolic obliteration so completely. For those accused of treason, the sentence meant more than death. It meant a transformation from living subject to enduring warning, a fate both public and permanent. By the late 13th century, England had developed a punishment unlike any other in Europe, a sentence designed not merely to kill, but to obliterate. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was reserved for men convicted of high treason, the gravest offense against the crown. It was not a single act of execution, but a sequence of deliberate humiliations and mutilations. Its purpose was to make the traitor's end a public event of such intensity that the memory would survive for generations. The process began in the courtroom. When a man was condemned to this punishment, the sentence was spoken in full detail before the gathered court. It was a declaration of what awaited him, that he would be drawn to the place of execution, hanged until nearly dead, cut open, disemboweled, beheaded, and finally divided into 4 parts. The wording itself was part of the terror. From that moment, the condemned knew the exact sequence of his fate. The first stage was the drawing. The prisoner was stripped to a simple shirt and tied to a wooden hurdle or sledge. In some cases, he was bound face up, in others, face down, his arms lashed to the frame. Horses pulled the hurdle through the streets from the prison to the place of execution. This was not a swift journey. The procession moved slowly, giving the population time to gather along the route. In London, condemned traitors were taken. From the Tower through the city streets to Tyburn, a distance of several miles. Every cobblestone, every turn of the road became part of the punishment. Being drawn served 2 purposes. It spared the condemned the indignity of walking, considered too much like the journey of an ordinary criminal, while also preventing any possibility of escape or resistance. It also maximized public exposure. Crowds lined the way, throwing refuse, shouting insults. For those accused of betraying the king, this was the first stage of erasure to be displayed. Helpless and bound, before the very people they had once lived among. At the execution site, the second stage began. The condemned was hanged from a gallows, but not to the point of death. The drop was short, designed only to induce unconsciousness or semi-consciousness through strangulation. Records show that in some cases the rope was cut while the victim still struggled, in others when they hung limp but alive. The object was not mercy but preparation for the next stage. Once cut down, the executioner moved to the disembowelment. The abdomen was opened with a knife, and the internal organs, particularly the intestines, were removed. In many accounts, these were burned on a fire in front of the condemned. Chroniclers from the 14th century onward record the executioner sometimes speaking the formal words that the entrails were being offered to the devil, underscoring the traitor's alleged betrayal of God as well as king. Death often came during this stage, but not always immediately. Following disembowelment, the head was severed. This beheading marked the formal death of the traitor. The head was then set aside to be parboiled in salt water, a process that slowed decay before its eventual public display. The remaining body was divided into 4 parts, each quarter cut at the shoulder and hip. These quarters were sent to different locations across the realm, often to towns associated with the traitor's actions. The head was usually placed on a spike above the southern gate of London Bridge, one of the busiest thoroughfares in the kingdom. The origins of this punishment lie in the reign of Edward I in 1283. David ap Gruffydd, Prince of Wales, became the first recorded nobleman to suffer this sentence, following his rebellion against English rule. Edward sought a punishment that would make clear the unique crime of treason, one that could not be equated with murder, theft, or any other offense. Hanging, drawing, and quartering became the legal embodiment of the king's absolute power, and the fate awaiting those who challenged it. Over the centuries, the punishment was inflicted on some of the most famous rebels and conspirators in English history. William Wallace, captured in 1305, was drawn from the Tower to Smithfield, hanged, briefly cut down, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. His head was set on London Bridge, and his quarters sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. The symbolism was unmistakable, the parts of his body scattered to the key regions of his struggle against England in 1606, following the failed gunpowder plot. Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators faced the same end. Fawkes, weakened by torture, managed to avoid the full agony by leaping from the gallows and breaking his neck before the executioner began the disembowelment. The others were less fortunate, their bodies divided and sent to be displayed in cities throughout England as a warning against any future attempts to overthrow the government. Even into the 18th century, the sentence retained its full ceremonial form, though elements were sometimes omitted. In 1747, after the Jacobite Rising, Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered for treason. Due to his age and status, the disembowelment and quartering were commuted, and he was beheaded on Tower Hill. Such acts of clemency were rare, and their rarity ensured the full version of the punishment retained its terror. The psychological warfare inherent in the sentence was as important as its physical cruelty. Displaying the head and quarters in prominent public locations served as an ongoing warning. London Bridge became notorious for the grim row of heads above its gatehouse. Travellers entering the city could count them, each a reminder of the crown's reach. Town gates, market squares, and castle walls across the kingdom displayed the limbs of traitors, sometimes for months, until decay demanded their removal. This public display was not random. The crown often chose locations connected to the condemned crimes, ensuring the warning was targeted. If a rebellion began in the north, a quarter might be sent to York. If a conspiracy took root in the west, Bristol might receive its grim share. Each piece was both a physical remnant and a political message. The traitor was not only dead but erased, their bodies scattered so that no grave could become a rallying point. The sentence was always carried out in public. Its rarity made it an event that drew huge crowds. Chroniclers record thousands gathering for the execution of high-profile traitors. The atmosphere, part judicial ritual, part public spectacle. For the monarchy, it was a chance to reinforce loyalty through fear. For the people, it was both a warning and a moment of participation in the life of the realm. By the early 19th century, sensibilities were shifting. In 1814, the sentence was formally abolished for all crimes except treason, and even then it was carried out in symbolic form. The last man to be sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered was the Cato Street conspirator Arthur Thistlewood. In 1820, in practice, he was hanged until dead, then beheaded, without the full sequence of disembowelment and quartering. By mid-century, the punishment had vanished from English law. Yet its legacy endured. The phrase itself, hanged, drawn, and quartered, remained synonymous with complete and utter destruction. In the medieval mind, it had stood as the ultimate fate, reserved for the ultimate crime. The images of traitors dragged through the streets, the scaffold work, the knife, the axe, and the public display of body parts formed one of the most feared sequences of punishment in European history. Its endurance across centuries was no accident. It was a punishment designed as a performance, one that began in the courtroom, moved through the streets, and lingered long after the executioner's work was done. For those who ruled, it was an irreplaceable instrument of control. For those who lived under their rule, it was a reminder carved in flesh that the crown's justice reached everywhere. Medieval chroniclers often wrote about war, famine, and plague in restrained, matter-of-fact terms. Yet when they turned to executions, especially the rare and elaborate ones for treason, their tone shifted. Some accounts were laced with moral lessons, others with outright revulsion, and a few with a surprising sense of spectacle. Together, they provide an unfiltered view of what it meant to witness one of the most feared punishments in Europe. The 14th century Westminster Chronicle describes, in striking detail, the fate of William Wallace in 1305. The chronicler records his capture, trial, and the sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering carried out in London. He notes the immense crowds that lined the route from the Tower to Smithfield, their jeers mingling with the noise of horses and carts. His words dwell on the dismemberment, not to revel in it, but to underline the justice, as the Crown saw it, of punishing a man who had defied the English king. Foreign visitors were often startled by the scale and ritual of these events. The French chronicler Jean Froissart, who spent years moving through English and Scottish courts, remarked on the precision with which executions for treason were staged in England. He contrasted them with those on the continent, where beheadings or burnings were more common, and noted that the English method involved more steps and more deliberate public humiliation. His accounts suggest a mixture of fascination and unease, an acknowledgement that the punishment was effective as a deterrent, but also disturbingly calculated. Eyewitness records from later centuries confirm that such scenes could provoke vastly different emotional reactions in the same crowd. In 1606, the Gunpowder Plot conspirators were executed in St. Paul's Churchyard and at Old Palace Yard. Sir Dudley Carleton, an English diplomat, wrote in a letter that the executions were well attended and that the crowd seemed satisfied to see the traitors meet their fate. Yet another observer noted moments of pity when the men prayed or addressed the crowd, showing that sympathy could intrude even in the most politically charged spectacles. In some cases, the reactions of the crowd became part of the historical record because they disrupted the intended message. The execution of Thomas More in 1535 for refusing to accept Henry VIII as supreme head of the Church of England drew a crowd that was notably subdued. Chroniclers recorded that his composure and final words about dying the king's faithful servant, but God's first, left many in attendance unsettled, even admiring a reaction that undermined the deterrent effect the government had sought. Other accounts show a far more visceral public engagement. In the Low Countries, where rebels against Spanish rule were sometimes executed by breaking wheel or hanging, witnesses occasionally surged forward to dip handkerchiefs in the blood of the condemned believing it held protective power. English records contain similar episodes. After the execution of Catholic priest Edmund Campion in 1581, parts of his clothing were taken as relics by sympathizers. These acts transformed state punishment into a contested space where official propaganda met private devotion or defiance. Horror and excitement often coexisted. Crowds could gasp or recoil at a botched beheading, yet moments later cheer when the executioner displayed the severed head. Chroniclers make clear that familiarity with public death did not erase the capacity for shock. In 1587, the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, caused murmurs of disquiet when the first blow failed to kill her instantly. The episode was repeated in pamphlets across Europe, proof that even seasoned audiences could be disturbed by the raw mechanics of killing. For some, repeated exposure to public executions fostered a degree of detachment. In London, Tyburn executions for common crimes drew such regular crowds by the 17th century that they became almost a form of weekly entertainment. Ballad sellers, tavern keepers, and street vendors turned the events into commercial opportunities. While this was less common for the rarer, more elaborate treason punishments, the same risk of desensitization existed. When horror becomes routine, its power to deter can diminish. Medieval moralists were aware of this tension. Some sermons delivered at executions warned spectators not to grow accustomed to the sight of death, framing the event as a reminder of divine justice rather than mere entertainment. Yet the authorities also knew that the spectacle's potency depended on keeping it in the public eye. To few executions, and the threat might fade. To many, and the crowds might stop caring. Chroniclers also reveal the ways such punishments could scar those who saw them. The 15th century London Chronicle records that after the 1415 execution of Sir John Oldcastle for heresy and treason, some onlookers were sore amazed for days afterward. Accounts from the Scottish border in the 14th century mention children refusing to pass certain gates where heads were displayed, a sign that the visual impact of the aftermath could be as enduring as the execution itself. At the same time, there were those for whom witnessing such deaths was affirming. Supporters of the crown might feel satisfaction in seeing a rebel destroyed. Members of a rival faction might find reassurance that their own loyalty kept them safe. The execution site became a mirror in which each spectator saw their own political and moral stance reflected. In the medieval and early modern world, public execution was a shared civic experience. It bound communities together in a common moment, whether that bond was forged through fear, righteousness, curiosity, or defiance. Chroniclers and foreign observers alike recognized that these moments were not passive viewings. The crowd was an active participant, its reactions shaping the meaning of the event long after the scaffold was dismantled. The punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering was especially potent in this regard. Its length, complexity, and sheer brutality demanded sustained attention. It created space for a range of human responses: revulsion at the mutilation, grim satisfaction at the justice served, or unexpected pity for the condemned. That very range is part of what made it such an effective instrument of control, and why it left such a lasting mark on those who witnessed it. In the medieval world, the line between justice and brutality was not drawn where it is today. Punishments that now seem unthinkable were, in their own time, justified as necessary, proportionate, and even righteous. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was the ultimate example, a penalty reserved for the highest crime of all, high treason. To understand why such extremes were tolerated, it is necessary to step into the legal, cultural, and religious frameworks of the era. Treason was not viewed as a single offense against a ruler. It was an attack on the entire order of society. In a world where loyalty to one's sovereign was seen as both a political and moral duty, betrayal struck at the foundations of law, stability, and divine order. Kings ruled by the will of God. To rebel against the monarch was therefore to rebel against God's chosen authority. This belief made treason more than a legal violation. It was a spiritual crime, deserving of a punishment that reflected its magnitude. Medieval law codes reflected this thinking. In England, the Statute of Treasons of 1352 formally codified the crime, specifying acts that would be considered treasonous and the punishments they warranted. This was not simply a list of offences. It was a statement that the king's person and authority was sacred. Punishment had to be severe enough to deter not only the guilty but anyone who might contemplate similar actions. Public executions served as a visible enactment of this principle. The extreme suffering inflicted on the condemned was framed as proportionate to the chaos their crime might have unleashed. The dismemberment of the body symbolized the destruction of the traitor's political power and the scattering of their influence. Displaying the remains was a public reminder of the fate that awaited those who challenged the crown. The Church's position on such punishments was complex. While medieval canon law prohibited clergy from directly spilling blood, it did not forbid church authorities from handing over condemned heretics or traitors to secular rulers, knowing full well what awaited them. The Church argued that it dealt with the spiritual judgment, while the secular arm enforced the physical penalty. This division allowed executions, even the most brutal, to proceed with ecclesiastical sanction, as long as the clergy themselves did not wield the sword or axe. In some cases, religious figures explicitly endorsed these punishments. Sermons delivered at public executions emphasized the moral lesson that rebellion and heresy endangered not only the ruler but the souls of the community. Fire, sword, and rope were described as instruments of divine justice, purging sin from the realm. The burning of heretics was often accompanied by prayers for the victim's soul, a ritual meant to reconcile the apparent contradiction between Christian mercy and public killing. Yet there were also voices of caution. Some theologians and moralists questioned whether extreme cruelty truly served justice. The 12th century cleric John of Salisbury acknowledged the need for punishment, but warned against excessive suffering, arguing that justice should be tempered with mercy. Such views, however, remained minority positions in an era when stability was fragile and authority constantly tested. Cultural values reinforced the acceptance of severe punishment. In a society without modern policing or prisons capable of holding large numbers for long periods, swift and decisive justice was considered essential. Punishments were not designed for rehabilitation. They were deterrents, warnings carved into public memory. Death itself was not always enough. The manner of death had to be so definitive that it left no doubt about the consequences of disloyalty. Symbolism played a central role. Beheading a noble signified that his life was ended, but his dignity preserved. Hanging, drawing, and quartering a traitor conveyed that his crime had stripped away all honor, reducing him to a body to be destroyed and scattered. The physical dismantling of the traitor mirrored the dismantling of their political networks and alliances. From the medieval perspective, such punishments were acts of restoration. A rebellion fractured the realm. The execution symbolically reasserted its unity. Public participation, the crowds that jeered, the merchants who sold food at the spectacle, the town criers who announced the crime, made the execution a communal reaffirmation of order. By contrast, modern human rights frameworks reject such reasoning entirely. Today, the deliberate infliction of prolonged suffering is classified as torture, prohibited under international law. The public display of executed bodies is considered a violation of human dignity. Trials are expected to be impartial, punishments proportionate, and the death penalty itself is abolished in many countries. Where it survives, it is carried out in private, without the theatrical elements that were once central to medieval justice. This shift reflects more than just legal reform. It marks a fundamental change in how societies conceive of justice. In the Middle Ages, the goal was deterrence through fear and the reaffirmation of authority through public spectacle. In the modern view, justice is tied to the protection of individual rights and the minimization of harm, even for those found guilty of serious crimes. It is tempting to judge medieval punishments solely by modern standards, but doing so risks misunderstanding their function in their own time. For a 14th century monarch facing rebellion, the fear generated by an execution like hanging, drawing, and quartering could prevent further uprisings. For the common people, watching such a punishment might reinforce the belief that the realm was secure and the ruler unassailable. Still, even in its own age, the punishment's brutality was recognized. Chroniclers sometimes described the scenes with a mix of detail and restraint, as though aware that the spectacle could repel as much as it deterred. Political leaders occasionally commuted the full sentence for high-status prisoners, not from compassion alone, but from a calculated desire to avoid creating martyrs. The medieval balance between justice and brutality was therefore not static. It was constantly negotiated between ruler and ruled, between law and custom, between the demands of order and the risk of public revulsion. Hanging, drawing, and quartering endured for over 5 centuries because it was effective in the terms of the society that used it. Its eventual abolition in the 19th century reflected a world that had redefined both justice and the role of the state in enforcing it. In the end, the punishment's legacy lies not only in its cruelty, but in what it reveals about the values of its time. To medieval rulers, it was the ultimate guarantee of loyalty. To many who watched, it was proof that the king's justice was absolute. To the modern observer, it is a reminder of how far the concept of justice has shifted, and how closely the definition of justice is tied to the world that creates it. By the early modern period, the same punishments that had once defined royal authority were beginning to look outdated, even to those who upheld the law. The decline of executions like hanging, drawing, and quartering did not come from a sudden surge of compassion, but from a gradual change in how rulers, lawmakers, and thinkers understood the purpose of justice. Over the course of 2 centuries, the scaffold shifted from being a stage for public instruction to a relic of an older world. The first signs of change appeared in the 17th century. Political stability in much of Western Europe meant fewer large-scale rebellions, reducing the occasions for the most extreme punishments. At the same time, central governments were becoming more bureaucratic, relying on written laws, courts, and prisons rather than on public demonstrations of power. While the death penalty remained common, the most elaborate forms of execution began to be reserved for fewer cases. The Enlightenment accelerated this transformation. Philosophers and legal reformers began to challenge the belief that cruelty was an effective deterrent. Cesare Beccaria, on Crimes and Punishments, published in 1764, argued that punishments should be proportionate, certain, and prompt, rather than spectacular and prolonged. Beccaria condemned torture and public brutality as harmful to society's moral fabric, suggesting that they desensitized rather than educated the public. His work circulated widely across Europe, influencing political leaders and jurists from Catherine the Great in Russia to reformers in Britain and France. In Britain, debates in Parliament and among legal commentators reflected this shift. While treason laws remained severe, there was growing discomfort with the mutilation and display of bodies. By the late 18th century, it had become more common for sentences of hanging, drawing, and quartering to be carried out in a largely symbolic way. The condemned might still be hanged and beheaded, but the disembowelment and quartering were often omitted, sometimes officially remitted by royal decree. Public attitudes were also changing. Urban populations were larger and more diverse, with growing numbers of educated middle-class citizens who saw prolonged public killings as uncivilized. At the same time, the rise of printed newspapers meant that the details of a trial and sentence could be circulated without the need for thousands to see the execution in person. The role of the scaffold as a necessary public lesson began to weaken. The decline of public executions was not uniform across Europe. In France, the Revolution of 1789 replaced the varied methods of execution with the guillotine, intended as a quick and equal death for all classes. Yet even this was initially performed in public squares, drawing large crowds. It would take decades before executions moved behind prison walls. In Britain, the turning point for treason came in the early 19th century. The Cato Street Conspiracy of 1820 marked one of the last times the sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering was officially pronounced. Arthur Thistlewood and his co-conspirators, accused of plotting to assassinate the British cabinet, were condemned under the old statute. But by this time, the punishment had been reduced in practice. They were hanged until dead, then beheaded, without the full mutilation and public display. This symbolic application signaled that the original medieval ritual was no longer acceptable, even for the gravest crimes. In 1843, Parliament formally abolished the disembowelment and quartering portions of the treason penalty, replacing them with simple hanging. The change reflected both humanitarian concerns and a recognition that the elaborate medieval sequence had lost its relevance in a modern legal system. By 1868, Britain ended all public executions, moving them into prisons. The final public hanging took place outside Newgate Prison that same year, marking the end of centuries of street-side justice. Elsewhere in Europe, similar reforms were underway. The Netherlands abolished the breaking wheel in 1795. Prussia banned public executions in 1851. In the Papal States, public spectacles continued longer, with beheadings and hangings still drawing crowds into the mid-19th century. But even there, the mood was shifting under pressure from liberal reform movements. The last recorded use of hanging, drawing, and quartering in Britain took place in 1817, against 3 men convicted of high treason for their role in the Derbyshire Rising. They were executed in Derby before a large crowd, but the mutilation was carried out after death and away from public view. The official end of the practice came not with a single dramatic event, but through a steady erosion of the ritual's elements until nothing of the original remained. By the late 19th century, the idea of executing someone in a public square had lost its political utility in much of Europe. Governments no longer needed the theatre of the scaffold to assert control. Police forces, standing armies, and expanding prison systems served that purpose more effectively. The same Enlightenment ideals that had fueled debates about punishment also supported the notion that justice should be carried out with dignity, and that executions, if they occurred at all, should be swift and largely unseen. This was not the disappearance of capital punishment. Far from it. Many states continued to execute criminals well into the 20th century, but the spectacle was gone. Where once a traitor's head might glare down from a city gate for months, their fate was now sealed in private, recorded in official registers, rather than in the collective memory of a crowd. The end of the public execution era closed a chapter that had lasted for centuries. The scaffold, the stake, the wheel, and the gallows had once been tools of both justice and performance, shaping the relationship between ruler and subject. Their disappearance marked the rise of a new relationship, one in which the state no longer needed to display its power through open acts of destruction, and in which justice began to be measured by the absence of cruelty rather than its presence. Though the last sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering was carried out over 2 centuries ago, the punishment has never truly vanished from the cultural landscape. It lingers in historical memory, in the pages of literature, in the lines of plays, and in the language itself. Its brutality has made it a lasting symbol, not simply of medieval justice, but of the extremes to which human authority can go when it feels threatened. In English folklore, the punishment often appears in tales of rebellion and martyrdom. The fate of William Wallace became part of Scottish national identity, retold not only in chronicles but in ballads and later romanticized accounts. In these stories, the method of execution served as proof of the oppressor's cruelty, while the condemned emerged as a hero. For the communities who identified with the executed, the spectacle meant to instill fear, instead reinforced defiance. A dynamic repeated across centuries in different political contexts. Literature has preserved the details in ways official records often softened. Shakespeare refers to it directly in Henry IV, Part 2, using the sentence as shorthand for complete destruction. In Richard III, the imagery of dismemberment and public display mirrors the political ruthlessness of the age. Even in works not focused on treason, the phrase hanged, drawn, and quartered became a linguistic device, a compact way to evoke total ruin, understood by audiences long after the punishment itself had ended. Historical novels, from the Victorian era onward, frequently depicted the execution in elaborate detail, drawing on court records and chroniclers' accounts. While some authors softened the reality for their readers, others used the brutality to underline the stakes of political dissent in past centuries. In doing so, they helped fix the punishment in the public imagination as the ultimate symbol of state retribution. Modern media has given it a second life. Documentaries, historical dramas, and even mainstream films reference the sentence, often using it as a marker of medieval severity. Popular culture has tended to focus on the most famous cases: Wallace, Guy Fawkes, the Gunpowder Plot conspirators, ensuring that the method remains tied to moments of high drama in national history. These portrayals, even when simplified, maintain the association between the punishment and the idea of authority. Pushed to its harshest limits, the psychological residue is harder to measure, but it is present in the way the phrase still carries weight. To describe something as having been hanged, drawn, and quartered in modern speech is to imply destruction beyond repair, even if only metaphorical. That the word still resonates speaks to how deeply the original acts embedded themselves in cultural memory. Centuries of chroniclers, storytellers, and political rhetoric have ensured the image never fully faded. The endurance of this memory also reflects something about human nature. While the scaffold was dismantled and the gates cleared of their grisly trophies, the fascination with extreme punishments remains. The execution's survival in story form suggests that people continue to be drawn to historical moments when the state's power and the individual's defiance collided in the most visible way. Whether seen as justice served or cruelty unrestrained, these events command attention because they reveal the outer limits of both authority and resistance as a tool of power. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was as much about the living as it was about the dead. It relied on visibility, on the reactions of the crowd, on the retelling of the event. Its fear depended on the shared knowledge that it could happen again to anyone who crossed the boundaries of loyalty. That it has remained in memory long after its abolition shows that fear, once established, can outlast the instrument that created it. Its legacy is therefore twofold. In historical terms, it is a reminder of the lengths to which medieval and early modern states would go to protect themselves from threats. In human terms, it is a reflection on the fragility of life when set against the machinery of authority. The men who faced this punishment were, in their time, rebels, conspirators, or political enemies. In ours, they are historical figures whose deaths illustrate the balance and imbalance between justice and power. The story of the most feared medieval execution tells us that law, morality, and authority are never fixed. They are shaped by the needs and fears of their age. What one century sees as necessary, another may condemn as barbaric. Yet the memory of such punishments endures precisely because they force us to confront the extremes, to ask how far a society will go to protect itself, and what it is willing to destroy in the process. In the end, the punishment no longer exists in practice, but its shadow remains. It stands as both a warning from history and a testament to the power of collective memory, ensuring that the fear it once inspired is not entirely lost to time.